Good evening, everyone, and I want to welcome you to this month's the Masonic Seminar Series. My name is Brother Katie, and I am your host for this particular seminar and every seminar. I have in the office with me Brother Patrick Alessandra and Brother Benjamin Hartle, who are working the various platforms on which we are streaming. So always a thank you to them for their hard work in setting up and running all of the platforms while we have this wonderful hour and a half to spend together. The Masonic Seminar Series is a subsidiary of Universal Co-Masonry, which is Freemasonry for men and women. We've been operating for about 8 years, and my job is to help you answer maybe some questions that you have about Freemasonry in general and Universal Co-Masonry in particular. Each month is a standalone presentation, so if you are just joining us for the first time, don't worry about it. You didn't miss anything that you would have to have in order to follow along with what we're doing today. Also, I want to thank those who are coming from around the world that are getting up in the wee hours of their morning to be with us, as well as those who are in the Philippines who are getting up on a Tuesday, which I hope is a wonderful day for them. The purpose of the Masonic Seminar Series is to help create an understanding about Masonry that can go as deep as we can without revealing any of the secrets of our rituals. Freemasonry is experiential. You need to experience it to fully understand it. If you pick up one of our rituals and you can get past all the acronyms and everything that's in there and you understand what it's being said, you really don't, because you have to have the context of ritual to do it. So our job here at Universal Co-Masonry is to help answer as many questions as we can without destroying the sanctity of the experience, because everyone's entitled to experience Freemasonry as it is intended. This evening, we'll be talking about the permanence of the soul. And why are we talking about that? I will address because it is one of our landmarks in Freemasonry, especially Universal Co-Masonry. One of the technical things I want to cover before we launch into tonight's presentation is that if you have any questions along the way, Brother Benjamin will be running the Zoom questions, so please send the questions to him, and that way he can streamline them and make sure they're on topic and that we can present them at the right time and get them answered throughout the course of the lecture. Brother Patrick will be taking care of Facebook, Zoom, and X when those questions come in, so that way, again, everyone gets a voice. I will remind you periodically to send your questions in because I absolutely love questions, but just make sure they're on topic. If we don't get to your questions, either that it was off topic or we just ran out of time. So please keep in mind, send your questions. We'd really love to do that and get those questions answered for you. All right, we're going to jump into tonight's presentation. There is a lot of material, which I hope I present a lot of material each month. The one thing before we jump into the permanence of the soul, there's one thing I want to correct from what I said last month. We did a question and answer session with everyone, and I made a mistake, and I want to correct it just so that way, if anyone was following that information, that they get the right information. The question that was asked was whether or not male craft masons can affiliate. And I had made this statement that you need to demit first and then apply. And that's not true. That has to do with other things that I got them conflated. So I just want to be very clear. If you are a male craft mason and you choose to affiliate with Universal Co-Masonry, that is very possible. There are some obediences that may not be, but with all male masonry, which are the Grand Lodges and whatnot from the United Grand Lodge of England or Grand Orient de France or anything like that, those are not a problem. You can contact me or you can contact our general office and we can talk about affiliation and what that looks like. But I do want to clarify that because I hate misspeaking and I wanted to make sure that was corrected for the record. All right, I'm looking here at my computer, so if I'm looking off to the side, I apologize. All right, so we're going to talk about a philosophical framework. This is a very different type of presentation because I think at first it's going to come off kind of disjointed, which I always hate doing that because I like it being very clear and upfront and transparent. I'm very fluid, but as I've been pondering how to present this and that it was coherent and articulate, I'm I just really there was no other way around it. So it's going to come off a little bit just disjointed, like I'm coming from two different angles, but hopefully early on I can connect those 2 points together for you so that way we have a very seamless experience together. So the last thing I want to say before we get into the first steps is just keep in mind that I've been in Universal Co-Masonry since 2002. These are my findings and my interpretation. If you talk to other brothers or other Masons, they will have different interpretations. And so this is what I'm presenting. And I want to just disclaim that because sometimes people think like I'm speaking on behalf of the order. And in a sense, I'm speaking on behalf of Freemasonry and Universal Co-Masonry as I have experienced it. So keep that in mind as we move forward. All right. So how are we going to spend the next hour and a half together? Well, first thing we're going to look at is what are the Masonic landmarks that we have in Universal Co-Masonry. I'll go over a little bit about what they are in general. I'm not going to belabor the point. I just want to touch on the surface and then get into the specific landmark, which is the immortality of the soul, or as I say, the permanence of the soul. Then we're going to be understanding philosophical frameworks. That sounds really great. And I'm sure you're like, well, what does that even mean? I'll use a more colloquial term, a more general term, which I think everyone will understand once we get to that point. But so we're going to look at landmarks and we're going to look at philosophical frameworks. And that's the two pieces that I'm going to try to tie together as they both dovetail into the permanence of the soul. In that I'm going to take it into the permanence of the soul. I'm going to make them unite through that lens. So the next part is what part of the philosophical frameworks, the aspects that make up a framework, what part of those aspects have to do specifically with the permanence of the soul? And then I'll give you some perspectives on the permanence of the soul. And I hope this last point, I tried not to do something mundane. I tried not to do something that was common in that, you can look at all the modern perspectives on the permanence of the soul, and perhaps you're very familiar with it through your own traditions that you practice. So I took a different angle that was very specific to Freemasonry, and those are the perspectives that I'm going to show you, is those that are related to Freemasonry. Those are the four key parts of the presentation and lecture that we will have this evening. And hopefully by the time we get to that third point, I can tie those two just seemingly, related aspects. All right, so, and then there's how can Freemasonry provide a lasting change? Why does it? How does it? That's the part that's very short at the end, but it's very important. All right, so Masonic landmarks. When we look at Masonic landmarks, the definition is that they're a boundary. They demarcate what is Freemasonry from the rest of the other religious, spiritual, philosophic traditions. So what makes them that this philosophy is specifically Freemasonry? If you fall outside of those boundaries, those landmarks, I think of them as exactly as it sounds like, signposts along the way that say, anything inside of this is Masonry. Everything on the outside is not. Even though as you get closer to the landmarks, it gets seemingly more like Masonry, but there are things, that are not Masonry, and there's some things that are close to Masonry. And we want to make sure that we know where one starts and where one ends. I thought it was important to put out the purpose of landmarks. And this is more of a generic thing, but you can make it specific to Masonry, which is what I did. So when we're looking at the landmarks are those concrete pylons that are ground into the base of the structure that you want to keep in place so that there is no encroachment or there's no hijacking of the masonry for the purposes of something else. So let me give you an example. So if you belong to Freemasonry and there's these set landmarks, and then the governance of Masonry, so whether it's a Supreme Council or the Grand Lodge or the Grand Master, whatever it is, goes in and changes those landmarks, then it can become something else. Freemasonry is not Christianity. It is not Wiccan. It is not Hermeticism. It's Freemasonry. So if you start to mess with the landmarks and change them into different things, then it stops being Freemasonry at some point. Maybe by one removal of a landmark, maybe by removing several. It just depends on how you approach it. So landmarks are, again, they're very concrete, even though they're very hard to define. They're concrete and you don't want to move them so that you can protect what Freemasonry is. Just like with any other religion, spiritual tradition, or philosophy, you want set markers so that you don't have any encroachment and it becomes something else. And the second part is the historicity. When you look at Masonry, Masonry has a long history. Some think it's shorter than others, but it has a long history. And when you keep the landmarks in place, it preserves and maintains the continuity of Freemasonry from whenever it started to the modern point. So landmarks help maintain a constant record of where Masonry has been and where it is going to, you can interpolate where it's going to go. Excuse me, extrapolate where it's going to go. And then one of the major points, and they're all very major, is that you want to protect the ritual from corruption. And in my mind, this is like quality control and quality assurance, if you're familiar with those terms. You want to make sure that when you're telling people like myself, like this is what Freemasonry is, that is exactly what Freemasonry is. We're not creating some different versions, a corrupt version or a perverse version of what Masonry is. So it maintains that integrity of the ritual. So the head of the order doesn't come in and just start pulling things out of the ritual or adding things in that aren't supposed to be there. Now, obviously, there's going to be exceptions. If you're familiar with any of my past episodes, I've talked about, times like the Great Depression or World Wars, where, times are really tough for people and it's very hard to have the manpower and the material to create a particular degree. So they might take something out to help simplify it so that it can be enacted. That has happened because of, major events, but ultimately it gets put back in because thank goodness we're not in a Great Depression anymore, or we, hopefully never going to go into another World War III, that type of thing. So we were trying to create integrity. So the landmarks are for integrity, for continuity, and for boundary. Those are the three words, when I say landmarks, I hope you keep in mind. And again, this can be applied to anything that has to do with a particular philosophy, but specifically in Masonry, that's what we call the Masonic landmarks. For some people, there is the idea of Mackey's landmarks. There's 25 of them, and those are what it is, but that is not the only ones. There are many other landmarks depending on the Masonic obedience that you belong to. There are three criterion that you have to have you should have when you create a landmark. Is it has to be fundamental. It needs to be a first principle of what that philosophy is about. It needs to be unchangeable. So once it's in place, you don't change it, because the problem with any moment in time, it's not just modernity, it's any moment in time, is that people like to change things to the time. So the time becomes the measure of all things. So, it's like, well, today this is how we view the world, and this is the lens we use. So Masonry needs to adapt to that. And that's not how it's supposed to work. A lot of the Masonic rituals, unless they've been recently changed, are in Old English, Old Portuguese, Old French, Old Spanish, whatever language. It's in the old version of it, and it is for a reason. And you'll see a lot of people will try to change things because it's not modern. And Masonry is timeless. It's not supposed to be modern or, ancient. It's timeless. It is what it is. And so having that unchangeable aspect is really important. And that will get into that second criterion will get us into one of the last landmarks that we have in Universal Co-Masonry, which a lot of Masonic obediences have in general. And then the third criterion, it needs to be defined, right? In order for a boundary to be made, it needs to define what it is and what it isn't. I've heard a lot in Masonic conversation over the past couple decades that Masonry is whatever you want it to be. And that's just not true. Masonry is what it is. It's like saying, you're going to date someone and that person's going to be whatever they want to be. So if you're lucky, then maybe they'll be what you want it to be. And that's just a bad way to approach dating. It's a bad way to approach Masonry, because you'll be very disappointed, because Masonry has an essence that is intrinsic to Masonry, which makes Masonry what it is. And so it needs to be defined in terms that we understand it as people, so that we can better have a relationship with it. Masonry is a relationship. It's not just a hobby or a passing idea or a really good book to read. It is a relationship. And, with any good relationship, there are things that are defining about that relationship, and its boundaries, and those boundaries do not change. All right, so let's get to the specifics of Universal Co-Masonry and its landmarks. And again, depending on the obedience that you're from or you're looking into or whatever it may be, the landmarks are going to be slightly different. So the first landmark we have, and I did pull this just right off of our website, so if you want to go back and look at them again, you can. And this is just the principles of the order. The first one is the belief in a supreme and absolute creative intelligence. This is the number one landmark. And I'm not going to go through each one of these because that's a totally different seminar. The second one is the one that we're going to spend our time with, which is the immortality or the permanence of the soul. The third one, the existence of a divine plan guided by the spiritual and scientific forces of evolution. So when we look at divine plan, that divine plan is coming from a creative intelligence. Keep in mind on that first one, it didn't say a supreme and absolute creative being. You can believe that. You can believe that it is an entity of some sort, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in some of the other Masonic obediences, it's like you have to believe in God, as in the Christian God. You have to believe in a higher being, or it's something that is anthropological. So you have to have something that is an entity. Universal Co-Masonry, we're broader than that. You have to believe in something higher than yourself. It has to be higher than humanity. It has to be something that is creative. It creates. And that from that creative intelligence comes a divine plan that is bound to these forces of spiritual and scientific. Again, the details are up to you to define. The development of a universal brotherhood without distinction. This is one of the landmarks that keeps us very unique from a lot of others, is that we don't care if you're male or female. We don't care who you love. We don't care who you sleep with. We don't care who lives in your house. What we care about is, are you a good person? That's why it's an application process. We don't just say, well, if you're this make and model, you're just automatically accepted. Brotherhood requires diversity, and in that diversity, it requires understanding, grace, and unity. And so having distinction that's based off of things you can't control. I can't control that I'm female. That's the way I was born, and you can't control the way that who you love and how you love. So not having those distinctions allow for unity in that diversity, because the diversity that we're looking at is, how do you understand what it means to live a virtuous life, and how do you put yourself out in the world to create a better place for the rest of humanity. That's what we care about, is you as an individual on the inside, not what comes out on the outside. The fifth landmark is the presence of an ancient wisdom that has endured from time immemorial. If you're not familiar with the phrase time immemorial, that means we don't know when it started. There is a beginning, we just don't know when. And you may have a particular belief. It could have been at the Big Bang, or when the Earth was created, or when the universe came about in some form. But there's an ancient wisdom, and that ancient wisdom is very important to us. And it is something that is obscure in Masonry. If you're not paying attention, you could probably live your whole Masonic career without it and not realize how much you're missing out. And that maybe someday I'll visit that ancient wisdom part. The fundamental unity of all religions. And the one thing I'll say about this is that religion means, to bind back to, regular. It means to go back to what once was. And that there are aspects in religion that all have a shared commonality. When you look at comparative theology, you're looking at not how are religions different, but you're looking at how are religions the same, and then finding out what's the difference between them in that sameness and the details. And in Universal Co-Masonry, it doesn't matter in the sense of like a disqualifier of what you believe in, because I can sit in a church, a temple, a mosque, a synagogue, any other sacred area, and find unity in that. And that's one of our key parts that help us with the fourth landmark, which is that universal brotherhood. Instead of fighting about who's right, it's about trying to find how we're all in this together, going in the same direction. The organization of Freemasonry as a spiritual hierarchy. This does make it a bit different from a lot of other obediences that tend to be more of a physical hierarchy. You know, you have the head, and then you have the officers, and then you have the brothers, and they're all working for a very material perspective. Universal Co-Masonry says that there's something behind that material. There's something that is bigger and grander and cosmic. And again, the details are up to you, but it is there in some form. Always the power of myth, legend, and symbol to, as well as ritual to transform. That's extremely important for initiatic orders. So all of these could be like separate seminars, but I'm not going to go too much through this. The freedom of thought, speech, and action when used in the pursuit of wisdom. So we have a saying in Universal Co-Masonry that you have the maximum amount of discipline with the maximum amount of freedom of thought. We do have a very disciplined way of being. You know, we sit a certain way, we dress a certain way in our lodge meetings, we address each other in certain ways, we conduct ourselves in a certain way, not just in meetings, but hopefully in all of our life. And there's no boundary to what you have to say and think and do when it's always done in the pursuit of light and the great architect and the divine plan. Obviously, if you're doing it to the detriment of all, there should be some pullback on that. And that's why in Universal Co-Masonry, we have a grand constitution and general rules and regulations that tell everyone exactly where the boundary of, you know, not so much what you can't do, but like go do whatever you want, but here are the rules that we all follow when we're in Masonry so that we can all get along and understand the rules of the game. I told you there was a part of the criterion that the last landmark was important because it was unchanging. The last and crowning landmark of all is this, that these landmarks can never be changed. So in Universal Co-Masonry, we're not going to change this, especially if there's fads. You know, like it's not in vogue to do a certain thing. And in about 2 minutes, just so you know, I'm going to interrupt myself. We're going to stop for questions. If you have any questions, please email or not email, message to the Brother Ben and Brother Patrick. So that way we can get the questions addressed. But going back to this landmark, people love and hate rules. They love rules that they agree with, and they hate the ones that they don't agree with. And landmarks, they're never going to make everyone happy. They're not supposed to. They live above the emotion. They are not for, you know, how people feel about, I don't like that landmark. Well, then that's fine. You don't have to like it, but it's not going to change. And either you can find a way to coexist with it, or you can choose to go somewhere else. Like no one's going to keep you here. It's really, really important that people understand that. It's also very interesting because in Universal Co-Masonry, men and women are called brother. And, you know, in the last 6 years, that's something that people try to hit on and say, you know, it should or shouldn't be that way. Depends on your perspective. And frankly, it doesn't matter what society is going through in this regard. This is what it is, and we're not going to change it because, you know, particular movement on this side or that side doesn't like it. Like I said, landmarks aren't meant to make everyone happy. They're there to preserve something higher than ourselves. So I'd like to stop here and see if there are any questions coming from any of our platforms before we move on.
Nothing on YouTube or Facebook.
Okay, then we will move forward. All right, so that's the first part, is landmarks. So keep that in mind. Obviously, we're going to focus on number 2. That is our goal for today. But now we're going to jump ship and go to something else. At least it seems like we're jumping ship. So at the beginning of this, I call this presentation a philosophical framework, which is a really lovely way of saying worldview. We're looking at worldview. And when we look at worldviews, and I will use both of them interchangeably, this is something that's really, really important because, and I'll touch on this a couple times, is when you sit down and think about like what you know and what you believe, first off, how often do you think about that? Some people a lot, some people not at all. And how congruent are your belief systems? One of the things that we will see, and I'll show you here in the slide, is that it's often more common to run into people who just live and don't think about why they do things. They just kind of do it out of compulsion for whatever is compelling them to react a certain way. They don't actually have a very knowledgeable understanding of the worldview. And that's really crazy because the worldview is how we see things. It is the only lens we have that perceives reality. And not having an opinion on that is crazy. That's wild to me. So when we look at philosophical frameworks, the structure is universal. And what I mean by that, we're going to go through the structure shortly before I tie this into the permanence of the soul. The structure is universal. That means that every single human being shares the structure, right? It's intrinsic to being a human being. What is variable is its content, and that's what we'll look at here. The content is different from person to person. It's informed by your upbringing and your social and familial connections. How you are in your world is how you're going to see it. Um, and one thing that is just kind of a stupid and kind of mundane way to put it, but I had the opportunity one time several years ago to London, and they have the big signs on the if you've been there, they have big signs on the road that tell you to look left before you walk across the street. And I'm convinced because I am, a narcissist and think the world is all about me, that those road signs were just for me. That England woke up and was like, this woman's going to come visit and she's going to get herself killed. Because in the US, we look right for when the oncoming traffic is coming so that we can walk. And this is telling us to look left because obviously they drive on the other side of the road than we do here in the United States. And it's kind of a weird example, but when I realized like the whole driving thing, driving on the other side of the road, the rules of the road are obviously different. Certain, you can't turn left without, that's the right of way instead of having to wait. Like there's all that stuff. It actually like made me flip my worldview a little bit because I realized things that I just took for granted that like that's just the way it is, kind of like gravity. It's not true. Imagine going to a different, country and it has a different gravity to it. It changes the way that you move in it. And I realized just how inward thinking I was because I just thought, yeah, like everyone looks right when you're crossing the street because that's where traffic comes from. And it's like, nope, that's not true. So the content is variable. And then what is most unique is the awareness of the philosophical framework that you live by. And I want you to take a moment, and this is rhetorical, I'm not asking you to respond out. I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about your worldview. And we have people from all over the world on this call. So our worldviews are going to vary all over the place. Some are Eastern, some are Western, some are going to be, more tropic, some is going to be more temperate. It's going to, maybe Christian, maybe, Muslim, you're a Muslim or you're Islamist, or you're not, maybe you're a pagan. I don't know. Pick something like your worldview. What is your worldview? And it's easy to give you situations like if you were in this situation, how would you react? It would hit certain key points about your worldview. And I think if you ask enough questions, you'll start to realize possibly that your worldview is very fragmented. That is how most people live, is that they're just kind of impulsive to whatever compels them to react a certain way. They don't think about what their worldview is. Now, I often talk about a micro example of this, which is, what is your morality? If you were to define your morality, what would it be? I want to zoom out on that and say, well, what is your worldview? What is the philosophical framework that you operate under? And I wonder how well you'd be able to define it. Because the crazy thing is that a lot of people require examples, or like I was saying, like if I put you in a situation like the trolley experiment, do you pull the lever or do you not? Either way, people are going to die. What do you do? Most people have to have those situations to help them excavate their philosophical framework. But even then, it's not fully understood and they're not fully conscious of it. And that is a very, I don't want to say it's precarious, but it's definitely a very illusory way of living because you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. You may know it in the moment, but you don't know on the broad scope. Like you don't really know who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. An example of a fragmented and disjointed worldview is a materialistic metaphysics. someone who says, I am very spiritual. And it's not just lip service, they try to live according to what they think their particular faith is. But really, they're just a materialist. Everything is just what you see it is. You can't prove it. It is what it is. And that's a wild place to be because they're incompatible as a relationship. And if you have an incompatible worldview, parts of it that fight each other, it creates for a very disjointed experience of life. So when we look at a philosophical framework, it's extremely, extremely important. And tonight we're going to touch on aspects of that worldview. And hopefully you're starting to see where this knits together with the permanence of the soul. Before we get to that, I want to talk about what are actually the philosophical parts of, how do I want to say it? The pieces that go to the framework. How about that? So the first one that you have, and I'm sure you can make the list bigger or smaller, but this is ultimately what I'm going to present to you, is metaphysics. What is ultimately real? When we say what is ultimately real, it's like, what is reality? That's metaphysics. It is beyond the physical. It is beyond. It is beyond. So if I were to ask you, and again, feel free to answer your own questions to yourself. Uh, what is your metaphysics? What is your platform that your entire worldview sits on? Could you define it? I mean, I'm not asking you to give me the really fancy philosophical term, but could you define what your platform is? And the one thing I learned is that if you cannot speak simply whatever it is you're trying to convey, then you don't know it. If you start getting really crazy and you're kind of going over, that means you're searching to find a way to define it for yourself. And if you want homework, as some people know, I'm very keen on giving homework. I would go through this list and I would ask yourself these questions and try to see if you can answer them and to see if you have any parts that are that are adversarial to each other or they don't quite lock in step. That will help you, streamline your existence. Epistemology, truth. How do we know anything? What is truth is usually how people define epistemology. How do you know? Especially in this era of information and disinformation, this is a really big question. What is true and what is not true? Um, that's really important to understand how you gauge truth. Like if I were to ask you, what is your metric for truth? Is that true and that's untrue? Could you do it? And if not, you should probably go figure out how you're doing it. Maybe reverse engineer it and say, I do it this way. So if I apply it to each situation, I realize I'm predicating it all on this measurement. Or if you don't like what you see, saying, oh, there's this epistemological, system. I'm going to ascribe to it and try to change my behavior to emulate that so I can better be aware of the information I'm consuming so I know whether it is true or not. Excuse me. Anthropology. This is obviously very important to us because it's about us. What is a human being? The question is, again, can you define what are you? And, are you going to use a biological answer? Are you going to use a spiritual answer? Does it have to be something that's measurable? Does it have to be something that's repeatable? What is a human being? One of the constant debates I get into with another brother who's much older and wiser than me, by the way. So you would think that I would listen, but nay, I do not. Are we human beings or are we in the process of becoming human beings? And we have gone the rounds for so many years. And it's like, well, the place you have to start is what is a human being? And again, in our very academic centric world, we think we have to find a textbook that tells us. And that's not necessarily wrong to get the ideas that are out there, but we need to really understand what it is to be a human. That is another part of that worldview. Ethics. What is virtue and what is vice? Morality. What are these things? How do we engage each other? How should I live? Someone can be very moral and completely unethical. And someone can be ethical and completely immoral. It depends on how it depends on the situation. But just to put it, morality is your internal compass that dictates the way you interact with other people. That's the ethics. I can follow the rules of society, but not actually believe in them. So that makes, I'm ethical because I'm following the rules, but is my morality, am I being moral? It depends on what my morality is. Teleology. This is purpose. Why are you here? These are all great questions, right? Like, why am I here? What am I doing? Why am I here? Teleology, teleo means the end, teleos. It's used in science all the time. It's a very good word. Why am I here? Purpose. Very important to understand. Soterology. Soterology is, think of it as method. Okay, we've identified the problem. There's a problem. And now we're going to fix it. And that is the method. So soterology is method. That's how do you live your life. So all of this other stuff is informing it. Soterology is actually how are you doing it? And you should look at how you do things. No, are you ethical? Are you moral? Are you following? Like, what is your method to solve the problem? Do you even know what the problem is? And you can start to see as we start going through each step of the philosophical framework, you can see why a lot of people just are unaware of their worldview. It's because it takes a lot of time and effort to understand it, right? And there's nothing wrong if you inherited a worldview. We all do, right? And you can change it. That's the beauty of it. But the only way you can change it is you have to be on some level aware of it. So again, soterology, how are you living? And does the way that you live fix the problem that you've identified? And the other last one is eschatology. Eschatology is the end, right? Okay, so I figured out the problem of life. I am trying to fix it through the way that I live. Okay, I've done that. Now I die. What happens next? Where am I going if I go anywhere at all? So eschatology is very important because ultimately people want to know, like, do I just go back into the ground or does something exist afterwards? So these are the philosophical aspects that make up the framework of the way that you interact with your world. So you can see that this is like heavy, heavy hitter on what are you as a specific individual. Um, so before I get to the next slide, what we're going to focus on now, I'm going to bring landmarks and worldview, and I'm going to bring them together. I'm going to mash them together. So hopefully you're starting to see where I've gone and where I'm going to go with this. When we look at the permanence of the soul, we're looking at it obviously is impacted each one of these aspects, but some more than others. So we're going to look at metaphysics specifically, anthropology, soterology, and eschatology. Yeah. Okay, I want to make sure I got the list right in my head. All right, so we're going to look at those four specifically to what it has to do with the permanence of the soul. But I want to give you a second before we go to the next slide. And again, if you have questions, please keep sending them into the respective people so that way we can get them answered. But when we look at this, perhaps also while you're trying to figure out your own worldview and your own understanding of these very big topics, you're also hopefully maybe starting to see where Freemasonry is coming in here. Because it is very important that we tie those together because one, this is about Masonry, but two, Masonry has a very strong opinion on worldview. And when I say strong opinion, I bet you're going to think I'm going to say, well, this is what your worldview has to be. Not necessarily. What it says, like I said, before we get into the four aspects of the worldview and the permanence of the soul, what Masonry says is it goes back to the landmarks. Here are all these different steps to the worldview. Here are all these different steps is not the right word. It's like spokes on a wheel. You have the wheel, which is the metaphysics, and then you have all the other stuff coming out. And the eschatology is like, as you roll the wheel, where are you going to put it to? And soterology is how do you roll the wheel, to that end. As you're putting this all together and you're looking at the human being, Masonry is saying your worldview, if you want to be a Mason, you don't have to if you don't want to. If you want to be a Mason, these are the parameters of your worldview to some extent. And again, remember, they're first principles. They're not like all of the details and the specificities of it. They're the pylons that are driven into the foundation of your metaphysics. And they say, okay, this is my worldview. And Masonry says, all right, well, if you want the rituals to be transformative, if you want the symbols to engage you in such a way where it becomes transformative, then you need to find a way to make this worldview and incorporate it into your own worldview. Or, as I like to say, it's kind of like a synthesis where you bring them together and you have a predominant framework, but you have your experience on top of it. And that's why Masonry is universal, meaning it doesn't matter the distinction that is between you and I. It can be for anyone who wants it to, wants that as a part of their life. And that's what makes it universal, is that you have the pylons and then you have the framework, you have that metaphysics that everything sits on, and then, the anthropology, epistemology, all of that. And it gives you a structure, because think of it this way. This is before the digital era, right? Back in the day when you would go to school, you would be given a book. And I'll pick chemistry. You get a chemistry book and it says, okay, this is, they're usually pretty thick. It's like, okay, this is the book. This is chemistry that you need to know at the level you're at, right? So here you go. And you can understand chemistry in that parameter, right? And there's different levels and different, types of chemistry. But having that book, like holding it in your hands, is like, okay, this is what I'm responsible for. I know that from cover to cover, that information is my responsibility. Well, in the digital era, and it's more like metaphysics, more like what's beyond the physical, there is no tangible boundary. It's like go study whatever, and it's just like you're thrown to the wind. It's like just it's so vast and it's so overwhelming. And that's what these questions are. They're very vast and they are overwhelming. It's like, well, what do I think about the permanence of the soul? And do I think that the creative intelligence is a deity in the sense of a being, or is it a power, or is it something I can't even fathom? At this point, these are very overwhelming questions. So it feels like we're in the spiritual digital era, and this is for all mankind. It's not just our specific era. That we're in this digital, spiritual era where it's like, man, this is way too much. Way too much. I don't even know where to start. I'm overwhelmed. Well, Masonry says, let's put this in a book for you. You have belief in the creative intelligence. You have the belief of the immortality of the soul. You have the belief that that the universe is a spiritual hierarchy. And then it's like, okay, all right, now I can go look at it and say, I don't really know a lot about the different ideas and thoughts on how we got here, who created us, if anything, and you can start studying that, and you can start to erect an understanding, right? The epistemology, start to understand what is true, and then you can start to understand, well, based off of my experience and who I am as an individual, well, what do I think about all this? Well, this feels right to me for whatever reason. That's what I'm going to hang my belief on. And then you can start building this beautiful thing. I like to think cathedrals because I love the classic architecture of the Middle Ages. And it's like these beautiful buildings, this edifice, this cathedral that is you, and it's your thoughts, and it's your feelings, and it's your spirituality, and it's your progress. And that's you, and you can build it. And the beautiful thing is you can redecorate and redesign any way you want. When you're a kid, you're given a structure that is passed to you from your parent, which is not wrong because you have to start somewhere, right? And then as we grow up, we can either accept that building as built, or we can sit there and say, okay, well, I really don't like this aspect of this spiritual edifice. I'm going to take that out. I'm going to move that out. But you can't leave it vacuum. You can't leave it blank, because then your structure falls. And then that puts you in a really dark night of the soul, because it's like, man, that doesn't work. So then you need to go somewhere else, and you need to find the philosophy and the religion that makes sense, makes sense with the structure. And there's lots of philosophical traditions out there. Doesn't mean that they're all right and equal and perfect and that they're going to fit your structure. And so what Masonry says, well, building a house, an edifice, a cathedral, is very hard. So here you go. Here's some apron. And here is some spiritual tools to work with. And you can start excavating and mining and creating and building. And you have a brotherhood. That brotherhood's going to help you build your structure. Now, ultimately, you're responsible as the master architect for it, but they will help you. They will sit there and say, I noticed that this part of the edifice isn't what you wanted it to be. You said you wanted it this, and it's more like this. Maybe you should visit that and see what that's about. You should check that, make sure it's what you want. And you work together, and then eventually you can reside in that space, and you can understand how it impacts the rest of the world and how the rest of the world impacts you. So It's very, very important that we understand those frameworks. I'm just going to check in and see if we have any questions that popped up. Okay, Brother Benjamin?
Yeah, so I have one question from Ava. Says, you said that Masonic landmarks wouldn't change regardless of quote unquote fads, and mentioned the brother title as an example. But is the admission of women not changing a landmark? And what are some of the other examples of fads that Masonry has rejected?
Well, that's a great question. It depends on the obedience. Like if you go from obedience to obedience, the landmarks are not the same. And Mackey gives 25, which a lot of people like to adhere to, but when you look at adding women into masonry, well, it depends on whether or not you accept the landmark as something that is a first principle, that is unchanging. I guess you can make it unchanging, and that is definable. Now, where did the landmarks come from? Who manufactured them? All of that comes into play. And if you look at the building guilds, there are transcripts with women stonemasons on it. Now, obviously, they're not numbering in the thousands. They are rare, but they are there. And where does masonry come from? Is it from the building, ages? Is it from the ancient mysteries? Ancient mysteries? The Pythagorean school had women. There's lots of them. I mean, obviously the cult of Mithra didn't. That was for, Roman legions. So it was all male. But, there were, depending on where you look at it, depends on where you pull your landmark. And Ava, you pulled on to something that I'll touch in at the end, which is in the ancient mystery schools, which Universal Co-Masonry adheres to, they accepted women. And so, no, that landmark wasn't a change. If you go to an all-male lodge, their landmark, not every single one, again, it matters, is that they won't be present at the making of a female mason. That doesn't mean that women can't be in masonry. They just can't be present at their ceremony of initiation. That is a very important distinction. I was just talking to a male craft mason the other day. I was visiting another state, and we were talking about this very thing. And he's the first male craft mason I knew that actually knew the distinction, because most just take it that there can't be female masons. No, we are here. I am proof, and I know a lot of others that they can be masons. It's just that they can't be present at it. So you have to have a wherewithal about the specific landmark that you're referring to. When you look at the landmark of, you have to believe in God, which is very specific, very Christian tone to it. Well, does that mean you have to be Christian to join? In some Masonic orders, you do. Not Universal Co-Masonry. Where did they pull that from? That's a very Christian thing. And again, it's not like I'm saying, well, my landmarks are better than your landmarks. I do think that Universal Co-Masonry has superior landmarks, because the more you get constrictive on your landmarks, right? It can go either way. The more constrictive you get, the less people are impacted by it. Likewise, if you get rid of them all, you still get less people impacted by it, because now it's one size fits all, and that's not how it works. So it just depends on what you're looking at and whether or not you agree with their interpretation, because there is interpretation that's a part of it. It's like law. You have the letter of the law and you have the spirit of the law. And so to me, when they say, no women allowed in masonry, you can go back to Anderson's Constitutions of 1717, and it says that you can't be present at the, making of a female mason, and they don't want, stupid atheists, libertines, and what's the other part? Women's in there. And I think thieves. They didn't slaves, thieves, women, the deplorables back of 1717. So you have to look at the history of it. So it's not so much a cut and dry, like, well, they're right and we're wrong. Depends on how you interpret the philosophy. It depends on how you understand the historicity, and it depends on how you put it all together. So Universal Co-Masonry, we firmly believe that masonry on the whole is a daughter of the ancient mystery schools. And so we try to emulate exactly what they gave us, what we inherited from them. Other fads that we have rejected. Trying to think. I know, like, we had big pushback, especially here in the United States, where we had the big, divide over transgender and whatnot, and whether, gender neutrality, if you will. And can you think, I don't know if,
Well, there's one trend we've resisted, but it's kind of a trend that's always there, which is the push to take a open stand in politics.
oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to gender neutrality. We in Masonry, we don't take a stance like in Lodge. I don't sit there and say vote this way or believe this way politically. We don't do that at all. We'll talk about politics. We won't talk about current events, but we talk about the ideas of politics. But we don't endorse one way or the other. Like every brother needs to decide what's right politically. Like that's not a place that we ever venture into. And there have been times where, wars. Big current events where people will come to the head of our order and say, we need to take a stance because they feel particularly strong about that. And it's nope, nope, that's not our place. We do not stand in the east of our lodge and say, you should vote this platform. That is none of our business. Just as it's none of our business on saying, because you love the same sex or a different sex, that makes you good or not good for the mysteries. Like that's none of our business either. So we transcend above current events, political tides. We don't, there was one time where it was like a move to become more secular and atheistic. We push against that. A move to become more, Christian, push against that. And again, it's not because it's like, well, we agree or we disagree. We just don't have a place in that. That's not our arena. So I hopefully that answers your question to some satisfaction. Great questions. Any other questions, Brother Patrick?
Yes, from YouTube, someone asks, might Freemasonry be understood as a continuation or expression of Renaissance divine humanism, as articulated by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino?
Chino. It is a continuation. There's aspects of Renaissance humanism in Freemasonry. Is it a pure continuation and thread of? I don't know if you could say that. I would say that if you look at Masonry as like a tapestry, and there's a lot of threads that make that picture, and you will see humanism in there. There's a strong aspect of me that definitely was cultivated in Masonry where I'm like, man, humans are pretty awesome. We can do a lot of stuff. Where before, if you look at some of the spiritual traditions, there's a vilification. It's not even like Christianity and other religions. Like you can even find it in like Gnosticism, where they're just like humans are terrible. I'm like, I don't know if I agree with that. And I would say that Masonry really fostered that part of me where I'm like, yep, humanity's worth saving because humanity can't save itself. So there is a part of that Renaissance humanism in Masonry, but is it like a strong like thread and connection? I wouldn't say necessarily so, but there is a element of it. So it's kind of in that kind of land and water meat type of answer where it's there, but it's not strong one way or the other. Great questions. Any other questions? Brother Benjamin?
Question from Brother Mark. What is the worldview for Co-Masonry? It would appear the landmarks make up the frame. What would be the parts of the building?
Brother Mark, you're trying to cheat. No cheating allowed. Ultimately, I won't give you that answer because I can't. Not because I hold some secret obligation that precludes me from doing that. I can't because the Masonic worldview, there are definitely, like I said, there are pylons, there are landmarks, but you can take so many different stances on it and have so many combinations. It's kind of factorial in that you have so many different ways that you can combine it that will still maintain a very strong, cogent worldview. There's definitely some wrong ones, like we'll talk about nihilism. That's no good. Materialism doesn't work too well. So there's definitely, like, again, if you're going to have boundaries, some things are going to fall outside of those boundaries, and that would be incompatible with Masonry, and it would block that transformation that Masonry is trying to get you to do. So, no, I can't give you an answer, Brother Mark, because the answer is too vast and it's very individual. And if is it Brother Mark Valkonen? Okay, I want to make sure I'm talking to the right Brother Mark. So you and I can talk, Brother Mark, all day long. And we've talked in the past, about the difference of like where Masonry puts you in spiritual or political or, ideological areas. And I can have that same conversation with someone else and it'd be a totally different conversation. And in fact, it's exactly what happened. You and I were talking about something, you're like, oh yeah, Masonry, I think really teaches us this. And a week later, a different brother said the exact opposite. And we both were right. And it was a very wonderful experience to see that. So we'll talk about Masonry. There are some key aspects where Masonry will say, pretty firm on this, but it's more like, as you know, for the market, it's like, live a virtuous life. Great. What does that mean? And that's more what Masonry's doing with your worldview. It's saying, here are the things like believe in a higher power. okay, you go define what that means. Well, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at that higher power. Okay. So, and we can talk more the next time I see you, Brother Mark, about that. But ultimately, there's not a very like, yep, this is what it has to be. Because again, if you had that, well, how would that worldview work? Because what if I was someone from the East or, the Far East or the Near East, or maybe I was somewhere, super South or super North, like I was outside of that Western perspective, then, we alienate. Masonry alienates everyone in that case. And so Masonry is smart. It is very, very smart in a lot of ways. And it doesn't trap people and say, well, you have to do this. It says you should do this. And these are your parameters and how you should do it. Great question. Anything else?
If you just give a reminder to send me a message rather than raising that hand.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, please make sure you send a message in the message app for Zoom or wherever it's coming from, because we don't always see hands being raised. And I want to make sure everyone gets their hands or their questions answered. All right, checking my time here. I am going to fly because, as always, I over-prepare just because I want to make sure there's enough. So as I told you, we're going to talk about 4 key aspects of your philosophical framework that have to do with the permanence of the soul. And we're going to start with metaphysics because, again, that's your foundation. When we look at, and I'm going to fly through these, so if you want to go down your rabbit hole, and I hope you do, and study these, I highly recommend it. Again, we're trying to understand the nature of reality. That's where you need to start when you're like, dude, I don't know how to dissect myself. Start right there. What do you think the nature of reality is? What is reality? I remember a very dear brother that I miss very, very much. She would always say, everything's an illusion. And it's not that she made that up. I know that's a very ancient philosophy. But she would always be like, how do I know you're just not a figment of my imagination? And I made you, and you're, this is all an illusion. And it's like, well, that was her worldview. And it deeply impacted the way that she proceeded in life, just like the way that I perceive the nature of reality. It impacts the way that I live my life. So ask yourself, what is reality? And be careful because each perspective has its pros and its cons. The problem that I saw with this particular brother, and I think, it ultimately consumed her, was that everything became an illusion. There was nothing real and something to hang on. And it really kind of drove her crazy because how did she know? It goes into that epistemology. Like, how did she know what was true and what wasn't if everything was an illusion? So be mindful with that when you look at your reality, you need to be objective. Again, objective means outside of your perspective, which is very hard to do, especially with worldviews. What is the nature of reality? What are the pros? And what are the cons of the way that you see things? And if you can't see it, go ask a friend. Go ask another Mason if you're a Mason. Ask someone you trust. That's why they're there. The reason why we ask this question is because by understanding what the nature of reality is whether or not does the soul exist. And I did not define the soul. You can define the soul any way you want. I know people do the soul as mental, and then maybe there's third parts, tripartite, where you have the spirit, like, there's a lot in there. I didn't go in there. This is for you to explore yourself. So define the soul and then ask yourself, does reality and I'm talking like reality. I'm not talking about your perspective of things. Like, does the whole cosmic universe have, what is it? What makes it up? And there's several different positions, and I'm going to just pull these out. As I said, I was going to go through these one on one, but we don't have time. So I'm going to pull out some of these. So the metaphysical positions that exist, and again, this is very general. I didn't go into specific religions. I did more philosophical stances. When you look at the positions, materialism is antithetical to Masonry because materialism says, well, what you have is what you get. It's very humanist. And when I say Hume, I'm talking about like David Hume. If you ever want to read A Labor of Love, read Treatise on Human Nature, still parsing through that one. And it's really ultimately like your 5 senses. Everything I see, touch, and feel, that is reality. Masonry asserts that there's more. There's more to reality than just what you can touch, see, and feel. How that is depends on how you view the ritual and how you study your various aspects of your worldview. So dualism is going to be that you have a body and a soul. That there's 2 substances that are distinct in this universe. Idealism is not like, oh, fantasy, like I am very idealistic. when we look at the metaphysics of idealism, we're looking at consciousness, that there's a conscious-based existence. And again, I was going to go through more of them. I'm looking at my notes if you're curious what I'm looking down. There's subjective, objective, which is Platonism and Neoplatonism. You have Hegel's absolute dualism. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. So go through and really just see, like, well, okay, I define the soul this way. And if you think there's a soul, then you're not a materialist because materialists exclude that. You need to figure out where this all fits together. So you have monism. When we look at monism, there's one underlying substance to everything. And then you have the opposite, which is pluralism, which is going to be that you have an irreducible diversity, that there are things so complicated and so distinctly different from each other that you can't reduce them into a single first or second or third principle. That there are many. So monism is that there's one pervading substance, and then pluralism is there's distinct substances that make up reality. Process philosophy is that reality is constantly in formation. It's in flux. It's Heraclitus, if you're familiar with the ancient Greek philosopher. Everything is in flux. Everything is moving. It's unfolding through time and space. So it's a process metaphysics. Everything's in motion. And then obviously my favorite, which I'm being facetious, is nihilism. And that is the denial of reality, that there is no reality. So out of this, out of these positions, Masonry would say, well, materialism and the rituals clearly say that there's more to life than just this experience, this five sensory experience. And nihilism, and a lot of these, I should preface, they overlap in all the different, teleology and, ethics and all, they overlap. So you might see some of these like nihilism, you'll see quite a bit, dualism, you'll see a bit. So they're different aspects of a major philosophy. So nihilism, that there's reality has no inherent structure or meaning. Well, what's purpose of a soul if there's no structure? Like, it denies the fact that there's any purpose to any of that. So metaphysics, does the soul exist? Ask yourself that. Does the soul exist? And then you need to ask yourself, how does it exist? Is it in the form of dualism? Is it in the form of idealism? Is it in the form of, what? If you're a materialist or if you're a nihilist, I'm not saying that masonry isn't for you, it's just not universal co-masonry. Again, I say this often, it's because our rituals would not speak to you. It would not be transformative in any way. Because it's a relationship where it's like, man, that was a really nice person I dated. It doesn't work. We're not compatible, so I'm not going to keep dating them. So keep that in mind that, again, there are definitely some landmarks that fall outside of that, push materialism and nihilism outside. What is the soul? Now we're going to look at anthropology. So when we look at anthropology, what is the soul? We need to look at what is the human being. Are we fallen? And if man has fallen, is it like the original sin of Christianity? Or is it the Gnostic understanding that there was a false deity that created things and man fell? Like, there's a lot, again, there's a lot. And when we say, what is the soul? We have to understand, like, once we have that metaphysical piece, again, you have to go through the epistemology, and then you get into, like, how do we know it's true? How can I want to say test, because, how do you test if there's a soul? That falls outside of the scientific process. But is man fallen, evolving, divine, or accidental? Well, that matters. Again, what are you as a human being? What makes us human beings? And when we look at this, biology has, at least back in the day, it was five criterion that give you the type, that you're alive, which unfortunately viruses don't fit in. But, outside of that, like, there are five things. It's like, this is what life is. Okay, well, out of that, we got the various kingdoms of, life. But what makes humans specifically human? What makes us, we can all probably agree we're alive. But what makes us different than the protista and the fungi and all of that? Like, what makes us us? They're again very different positions. Oops, sorry. There are very different positions on this. The materialist I've already explained. The dualist, when we look at the dualism, again, that goes back to, is there a body and a soul? And how are they, do they create the human being? Obviously, the materialist is a biology perspective, it's biological. Based off of this checklist, if we can check all of these things, then you're a human being. That's why when you die, you die, and there's nothing that continues. That's all you are, is your biology, the complexity of your biology. And interestingly enough, there's an emphasis in materialism that has to do with your nervous system. You are a product of your nervous system, which is a very interesting, nuance. I've talked about idealist, that the body is temporary and the soul continues. Existentialist, which everyone likes to talk about, existential crisis and stuff like that. But when we look at it, an existentialist, there is no predetermined identity. So there's no built-in purpose. A human being has to kind of create its own. When we look at classical essentialist, this is going to be Aristotle, and this is a defined and very fixed nature. So that man, the rational animal, that man is something very, very, very specific. And you should read Aristotle if you want to know what that is. Developmental and social, social is the one I care more about. That's not true. Developmental I care about too. Developmental is going to be that man is in the process of becoming. It's very Platonist, that we are in a state of becoming. And social is that we are created by our surroundings. It's a social construct. Who we are is a product of our environment. So if we understand what the human being is, it by default creates its own definition of what the soul is. So the first question is, what is there a soul? How does it relate to reality? And then the second part here is, well, what is a soul? And that is something that's extremely important, because can the soul be impacted by social constructs? Is it outside of social constructs? How does it work with, purpose? And if there is a purpose, again, that's teleology. Like, how does a soul, like, it all goes together. When man falls, did man have a soul? Or did man get the soul because he fell? Or does man get the soul as he evolves? Like, the more conscious you are, does your soul like become aware, or do you get a soul in the process of becoming? Are you, like the Orphics, who believe in the idea of divinity, that is, you're part divine and you're part Titan, or you have a Titanic personality that's volatile, but there's a part of you that's divine. How does a soul play into that? And how do you define it? I always love me some alchemy. So when we look at soteriology, we're looking at whether or not the soul can change or evolve. They're all very, very big questions. This is really big because this goes into your eschatology, where you're looking at, well, if it can change and evolve, what is the end game of this? Remember, soteriology is your method. So right now, if I were to say, review your life in the last year or 5 years, what is the method and how you're living? Are you doing the things that you think you should be doing? Not that feels great or someone else told you to do, but like, do you live the way you're supposed to be living? And if you are, what does that look like? And these ones I kept very simple instead of giving, like the actual philosophical name. So positions. When you look at what, does the soul change or evolve? The positions of soteriology is like, well, yes, we're assuming that the soul changes and evolves, because there's a problem, right? Like, so when you look at man falling, if man fell, well, that's a problem. Okay, that's great. How do we fix it? That's the one thing in Masonry is really preoccupied. It's like, okay, well, how do we fix it? We wear aprons, like we're about building and construction and fixing and moving. We're about action. So we have to identify the problem, and then we have to figure out how to fix that problem. And that has to do with method, and that impacts your soul, if you believe in the soul, right? So to know is gnosis, right? So we're looking at the problem here is going to be ignorance, And obviously, the solution would be knowledge. The more I come into understanding, the more gnosis I have, my soul is either going to be changed to the right state, or it's going to evolve into something else. To receive is where you're going to see a lot of more religious traditions. This is divine aid, right? So some would say grace. So when you look at divine aid, to receive means that you are getting something that you couldn't achieve on your own, right? So I'm going to take Christianity. I'm more familiar with that particular Abrahamic religion. So in Christianity, you cannot save yourself. You are incapable. And so you have a salvific figure such as Jesus the Christ coming in and atoning for your sins for whatever the various theories are on that. And that creates the bridge that allows your soul to pass over into the end game, into the eschatological end game, right? That would be divine aid. There's something that human beings inherently lack that does not allow them to get to the end game. And that would be, so if you are a Christian, you're going to live by a certain method, right? A certain practice that allows you to get into the space where you can receive that divine aid. So when we look at the third bullet, to do is action based, right? This is going to be discipline. This is going to be works and ethical action. We're looking at virtue worldviews, virtue frameworks, like Masonry is one of these. Not that Masonry is just this, it's many things. So the problem here is moral imbalance, right? Something is morally off. So Masonry and various systems like Masonry are going to try to impart ethical understanding. So how do you live an ethical life, a virtue-based existence, to help bring that morality back into balance? So the problem with when you look at this particular soteriology is that there is inherent imbalance in morality. When you look at to train, that's going to be your discipline and self-mastery. This is Stoicism. People love Stoicism. And there's, not yoga in the Western tradition, but in the Eastern tradition and some parts of Buddhism practice this discipline. The problem with that they see, the people who practice this, that the problem they see in life is that there is an uncontrolled desire that causes disorder. So through transformation is achieved, through practice and repetition. Right. And I would argue even part of Masonry does this as well, that we have lots of repetition in ritual, and there's a lot of practice, and there's a lot of self-mastery and discipline. So we're trying to control that desire that gets in the way, that causes that disorder. Escape, I don't necessarily like this word, but I couldn't think of a better word. But this is like liberation or release. And the problem with that is identified in this particular belief system is that the soul it's entrapped, it's in bondage, and the answer is to find a way to detach, to get the soul to pull away from the perceived reality, to get it to detach so that it can no longer be in bondage. And you could also see this in some ways with Christianity because of the bondage factor. The detachment would come through, a salvific figure to help you release those bondage. Then you have in the state of becoming, this would be like Hermeticism, alchemy, initiatic systems. Again, Masonry would fall into this. The problem here is that we see that humanity is an incomplete or unrefined state. So how do we fix that? We have to live a life of gradual change. So here, the soul is going to slowly change over time and hopefully be evolving, right? So evolving isn't just change. Evolving is change for the better, right? You have to have that qualifier that you're changing for the better. And so in this, idea of of this idea of becoming, you are going to go through processes that help you get out of that incomplete or unrefined state. The self-made man, the sculpture of the self-made man is a beautiful example. So if you're familiar with it, or if you're not, it's the man who's bent over with a mallet and a chisel, and he's chiseling himself out of stone from a quarry. And when you look at this, the quarried stone is a very unrefined state, right? And when you look at the process of the method of chiseling yourself out, that is slow. And not all of us are Michelangelos. It would be really nice if we were. Not everyone can see the sculpture in the stone, right? So we have to go through practice and education to try to remove each piece of stone in the right way, so ultimately the soul can be liberated from that unrefined state. So return is union. When we look at union, this is like Sufism or Neoplatonism. And the problem that they identify with humanity and being in this reality is that, again, it goes to that illusion, the illusion of separation, the illusion of individuality. Modernity doesn't like this one because it's saying that individuality is the problem, right? We live in a very hyper-individualistic world. And so when we look at this, the process of getting the soul to change and evolve would be through the reunification of the ultimate reality. So you're trying to find a way to come back to the one. So you're returning to that state from which you fell. And then the last one is going to be no salvation. So you just have to accept life as it is and create purpose. So nihilism and existentialism, you have to create your purpose or it has no purpose. The problem with the life is that it lacks meaning. There's nothing, everything here has no meaning. And the method is that we either are self-creating and we accept the absurd, right? So the brother I was telling you about who was all about the illusion and everything is illusory, she fell down the slippery slope into that nihilism where everything lacked meaning. And human beings don't really like that place. That is not a very, very fun place. Okay, I spent some time on that because I think that's important because we're all about action, right? In Universal Co-Masonry, we're all about applying what we can to our life so that we can get to the end game. So then we get to eschatology. Again, I've been saying that's what happens in the end, and I apologize for having to fly through this so fast. I'll let you read the different ones, the different outcomes. Resurrection, restoration, reincarnation, annihilation, conditional survival. Conditional survival is that, you will continue as long as you meet certain conditions. Universal restoration is going to be that all things return back to harmony. That sounds a lot like Pythagoras in his Pythagorean school. Everything is brought back into order. So again, when we look at, does this soul endure? Okay, so, I've identified what the soul is. I answered the question, I should say, that there is a soul in the affirmative. And then I put the parameters of the definition on it and said, okay, this is my understanding of what a soul is. Then I said, okay, what's the method to get that soul to go on? Because obviously outside of the various philosophic traditions I spoke about, like materialism and nihilism and existentialism, like the soul continues on. It's the soul that needs to get to the end game, not so much the body. I know there are some exceptions to that rule. I know like Mormons believe that the body passes on and is perfected. I know there are other traditions like that, but typically it's all about the soul getting to whatever is at the end. So eschatology matters because you kind of have to reverse engineer it. It's like, okay, well, if this is the end, and this is what my soul is, then the soteriology matters, right? Like the soteriological pathway of how do I get from point here to point here? And that's the process. And Masonry is a part of that soteriological experience. It's like, okay, well, there's a lot of ways to live. Masonry says if you try it this way, if you do it through this scope, you're going to make it happen. Now, again, it doesn't say like to the T, like you have to do it this way, this. It says these are the methods, and if you can get through those methods, you will have an effort. All right, so here's the curveball, and I have 5 minutes to bring it to you. The curveball, I talked about it a little bit at the beginning. Universal Co-Masonry insists that we are heirs to the ancient mysteries. And so instead of telling you like the various traditions of like, oh, well, Islam believes this and Christianity believes this and Hinduism and, Jainism and, you can go look that up. That's not that hard. And you can look this up too, but it's like, you already know that. But if we're the heir to the mystery schools, let's talk about some mystery schools and what they thought about, the permanence of the soul. Obviously, some of these, like the Eleusinian mysteries, are hard because the initiates were under penalty of death if they told us anything. So there's nothing really written about the Eleusinian mysteries. But this is one of the favorite of the Greeks, that with the Orphic, which we'll talk about next. So they were taught these initiates, as far as we can tell, based off the testimonies and things that were written down. They were taught how to lose the fear of death. Anyone who tells me that they're not afraid to die, I would say that is an incomplete answer. Um, we are hardwired to be afraid of death, whether that's just the body talking on its own or that's the body talking for the spirit as well. Like that's up to you to decide. But if we could lose the fear of death, then we can maybe see the end game a little bit better, and we could live this life a lot better. And so when we look at the Eleusinian mysteries, this is their central myth is based off of Hades, Persephone, and Demeter. And it was a lot about cycles of life, and everything is cyclical. The problem with a lot of modern day perspectives, it's very linear. Like we're just going to end and that's it. And human beings don't tend to like that outcome. That's why when the universe is getting destroyed in whatever Marvel movie that's out recently, it always gets saved, right? Because no one likes it just ending. And so in the Eleusinian mysteries, it was teaching us about the cycles. Now, granted, it was a lot about seasons and whatnot, but it's teaching us that there is no permanent end. And that if we can overcome the fear of death, we can receive that cyclical experience. One of my favorites, the Orphic traditions. If you have not had a chance to study up on the Orphic tradition, Orpheus is an exceptional um, character. Now, some think he was real, some think he was mythic. It's kind of like Hermes Trismegistus. It depends on your perspective. I don't think that really matters. It doesn't negate the profundity of this story, which is a very cosmological. So there's a lot about how the world came to be, how humans came to be. It's cosmological myth, and it has to do with the Titans, Dionysus and Zeus. The Titans destroyed the divine child of Dionysus, and then Zeus, destroys the Titans or enslaves them. And this is a symbol of the soul being trapped in matter. So the soul is of Dionysus, but matter is the Titans. And so it has a very, very strong essence of the soul needs to be liberated, has to be done through purification. That means ritual, which Masonry loves, ethical living, which Masonry loves, right knowledge, very Buddhic. But Masonry also is on board with like you need to remember recollection, right? That Platonic idea. You have to remember where you came from. You're not of the Titans, you're of Dionysus. Initiation. Some would say that the Orphic mysteries were actually much older and which are the foundation of all other mystery schools as we know it in ancient Greek times. I don't quite know where I stand on that personally, but that's something I have come into understanding is that this is probably a little bit older than the Eleusinian mysteries. However, the Eleusinian was much more favored in Greece at the time. And the Orphic tradition says reincarnation. And again, there's a lot of different types of reincarnation. So don't just sit there and be like, oh, it's the Hindu way, or it's like there you go look it up because there's a lot of different ways to perceive reincarnation, or the transmigration of souls. The interesting thing is reincarnation, again, it's not that endless, like you're just stuck in cyclical experience, is that at some point you become so purified that you can break the cycle of reincarnation. And that's ultimately what the Orphics were trying to do. From the Orphic golden tablets, they have, I am a child of earth and starry heaven. And I just liked that quote. I thought that was very, very beautiful. I know I have 1 minute, so please stay with me for another 5 because I'm almost done for those of you who may be looking to jump off here shortly. The Pythagorean tradition, the Orphic and the Pythagorean traditions are similar, but actually very different. A lot of people tie them together. Orphic is mystical and mythic. Pythagorean is going to be more I would say precise in the sense that it's about order, proportion, harmony, number. We see again, like I said earlier, the Pythagorean tradition had women. Pythagoras' wife and daughter are known to have been in his school. Again, a strong a strong belief in the continuity and continuity of the soul, and it requires purification. But this wasn't to break the cycle. This was to go back into harmony with the spheres. So the problem, the soul is out of harmony, and the solution was mathematics, music, ethical discipline, and communal life. That communal life is that brotherhood that Masonry has definitely a common thread with. And the communal life is the reinforcing nature of, it gives you structure and it gives you accountability. I do expect my brothers to tell me when I am not doing what I said I would be doing and what I've obligated myself doing. So there is a relationship that is required. There's a reason why human beings aren't solitary creatures, despite what many of us think. And if you didn't experience COVID, like most people, you would definitely know, like no one likes being behind a wall and unseen and unheard. All right, 2 more slides and then I'm done, I promise. Unfortunately, the Egyptian temple traditions, I can't go into great detail with. We're running out of time. I did keep it brief. They believe in the 4 parts of a human being. You have the physical body, the vital essence, individual personality, and then you have the affective spirit. And they have one of the most comprehensive anthropological doctrines on composition of a human being that we know of. So if you want to start somewhere, obviously the Egyptians predate the Greeks. So go look into this if you're a big Egyptian nut or you would just want to know that there is, the soul is so important that there are temple traditions from ancient times that go through this. And this is just of the Western perspective, and the Egyptian being a part of the Western perspective. There's the there's the Eastern versions that I haven't even covered. So, when you ask yourself, what is the soul? How does the soul evolve and change? Where is it going to go? Like, I would hail back to the mystery schools and see what they've done there, because initiatic orders all are predicated on those systems, and they have a better, I would say they're closer in time and space to the perennial philosophy than we are in modern times. All right. So what does this have to do with Masonry? Brother Mark, here's your question that you brought up earlier, and here's the answer to it. Masonic philosophical framework, what it does is it's doing what I'm asking you to do now. It is trying to get you to confront your worldview, to understand it, to refine it, and then integrate it all into one cohesive, cogent understanding. The more aware you are of your worldview, the more you know you, right? Like, you'll understand yourself more. And Masonry does it through symbols, right? Symbols make you engage in reality and the metaphysical sense of the world. Makes you engage in metaphysics. The ritual is transformative. If you're, compatibility, I often use blood types as an example. You have the blood type that if you're going to do a transfusion, you can't just do any blood type. You need to have the right blood type. It does matter. And when you look at ritual, if your worldview is not the right blood type, it's not going to be a great transfusion. It's not going to help you in any way. It could be strong enough that it has a deleterious effect to you. You don't want that on you. So you have to be very mindful. It engages through ritual, symbols. It's very applied. Unfortunately, I think this is where a lot of Masonic obediences fail, is that it's just theoretical. Like, let's just talk about it tonight and we'll go home. That's great. Universal Co-Masonry, we're all about application. Like, apply what you know. Go home and dissect yourself and apply what you've learned. Come to understand knowledge as it should be, so epistemology, and integrate that into your system. And then you will have that soteriology. You will find the method. And then the identity is what engages you as a specifically. It engages your identity. Who are you? How does it impact what you are? And so with that being said, I love this particular Masonic version of the broken column, which signifies death. And this is the Weeping Virgin. And I absolutely love this. And it's like, we got to meet death with a friendly face and meet it as a friend. And if we don't, how can we change that? Because hopefully we learn that death is transitory and that the soul is permanent. So I want to just thank everyone for coming out, and I apologize for going over and having to go fast on the last half there, but I did get through all my material, which was great. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. You have my email. And if not, you can contact us through our website, and someone in the general office can assist. But I hope that tonight you received some information that gets you curious or helps fulfill a part of your curiosity, that you will go and discover who are you and how does Masonry fit into who you are, if at all. and that you have control over your own understanding. It doesn't have to be a game of chicken, just try and see what fails before something hits you and runs you over. Make sure you look right too, as well as looking left, and look both ways. And life can be a challenge, and it is a challenge. It's supposed to be, but there's a purpose behind it. I wholeheartedly reject nihilism, that there is no purpose, and that once you find that out, you'll find your transcendent, that star to hang your direction on. That so when you're out on the ocean of life, that you'll be able to direct yourself to the right place. Because if you just let your boat go, you'll either go nowhere or you will go somewhere you never wanted to. So be the master and commander of your own ship and look at your worldview, understand your philosophical framework, and see how Masonry can empower you to better understand that and better live it. I want to thank everyone for spending a part of your day with me, whether it was in the night, in the morning, in the early morning, whatever it was. Thank you very much. It was wonderful to spend the time with you, and I hope you will join us next month when we look at another aspect of Freemasonry. Have a great night.